Hi everybody, this is Karen from Soterion, and you're listening to the SAP Security and GRC podcast with host Dudley Cartwright, helping you on your journey to effective access risk management in SAP. In today's episode, we'll be discussing organizational level controls. We will answer the following questions. What is it? Why is it important? And why is role methodology important for organizational level controls? We'll be joined by industry expert Emile Steyn from Soterion. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome everyone to today's podcast. So we're going to be talking about organizational level controls. I just want to spend a few minutes explaining what it is and why it's important. So again, I'm being joined today by Emile Steyn. Emile, thanks for joining. And my name is Dudley Cartwright. We're both from Soterion. So just to explain what is organizational level control and why it's important. So when you're looking at SAP security, your primary control will be making sure that people are assigned the correct transaction codes. So who in the organization can create purchase orders, as an example. This is either done by looking at segregation of duties or looking at individual transaction codes and determining who in the organization should be allowed to perform certain functions. So organizational level control is often not as well controlled, and it's making sure that people who can perform certain functions or certain transaction codes for which organizational levels, which company codes, which plants can those users perform those activities for. It's possibly less of an important control for the smaller organizations that are running SAP. A lot of the time, those smaller organizations, they may only have one company code and a handful of plants. But generally, as the organizations get larger and you move to more of the multinational type organizations that span multiple countries, etc., then you often find that it becomes a much more important control. It becomes more important to make sure that the people who are in Australia can only post and create purchase orders and post journals, etc., for the company codes and plants that belong to Australia, and that they can't do that for the other regions or the other territories. So it is a control that definitely seems to be much more important to the larger organizations. So again, I'll hand over, Emile, to you now. So why is it important that companies get their organizational level control correct? What are some of the challenges with it, and what are some of the incidents that can happen if you do not have correct organizational level control?
Yeah, thanks, Dudley. So I think what you mentioned there at the start, transactional access is usually, that's the obvious things for companies to manage and manage well. But because the organizational levels is controlled at a lower level, at the authorization object and field level, is often mistakes made on that lower level, or there's a star value where there shouldn't be one. Now, and that is often not reported on very well, where most focus is on the transactional access. So as an example, what we had at a company, they had some issues specifically with organizational levels. So when we came in, what we noticed is that they were busy with an S4 project, and that they were at the go live process where one company or people could create journals for their specific company, but because there was no control on the company code level, people from all around the globe could actually post those journals. So it was in a park state, and then people from a different region actually posted those journals, and that led to a big audit finding for them. So it's very important then to make sure that only the correct people have access to the organizations that they're responsible for. And as I said, it's historically, it's not reported on well, and I think we'll cover that in a bit.
Yeah, I guess then, besides that example that you illustrated there, Emile, besides being an audit finding, there's also, we've seen this happen at quite a few organizations. Users from, say, the sort of South Africa company are posting into the German company, and so there's a huge cost or effort to go and correct that. You've got to go and reverse all of those journals and repost them. So it's not only going to be an audit finding, there is some cost that the organization does incur to go and correct those incorrect postings. So you mentioned there also, Emile, that it is a more difficult control to administer, and I guess comparing that to the transaction code or transactional access control, where you can just make sure have the correct people been assigned the ability to perform this transaction code, and so that becomes a much easier control to sort of administer. But with the organizational level control, technically, why this is more challenging is, unfortunately, a lot of the time, the same authorization objects have been linked to multiple or different transaction codes. So it is more difficult to set this up and define this control. It becomes much more difficult because there's literally hundreds of thousands of authorization objects that exist within SAP. It becomes quite difficult for you to also continuously sort of analyze, have people have been assigned only the appropriate org levels, because they are inheriting these values from so many different authorization objects across the board.
Yeah, so apart from the fraud and possible mistakes that can creep in with that, I think another consideration there is now also privacy regulations, so if we look at GDPR, is where users users from outside of Europe is not meant to be looking at data from European users or European entities. So, and that can also then be controlled at the organizational level to ensure that cross display access, where display access historically has not been that sensitive, but now that additional control on organizational level becomes very important in the display access as well.
Yeah, true. Now that the data privacy regulations, you're so correct there, are definitely placing a lot of emphasis on organization level control, making sure that people can't see any personal data that they should not be able to see. Okay, so then just looking at how would you sort of implement an effective organizational level control sort of security approach or framework within your organization? So I guess the most obvious one is the role methodology. Do you have a very well-defined role methodology where it's very easy to see, which all level values, which company codes, which plans are contained in a specific role, that when that role is assigned to a user, it's very obvious for which company codes or plans can that person perform those functions for. And I guess besides the role methodology, I'm going to hand this over to you in a second. Besides the role methodology, I guess a lot of companies or organizations would rely on the access control GRC solution to try and help sort of highlight or identify this. But there are some, unfortunately, the access control GRC solutions, that's not one of their sort of strengths. They're not good at highlighting if a person has got some org levels for which they do not belong. Obviously, there are some solutions like ours that do a very good job of that, but when you look at SAP GRC, it's not, it can be set up, but it's a little bit more challenging, a little bit more technical to produce those reports to see if people have got access for those paths for which they do not belong. Okay, so do you want to just touch on the role methodology there and why that's so important to get that right in order to make sure people have got the correct role levels?
Yeah. I think it's important to first understand also which are those organizational levels that you do want to control on, and then make sure that the methodology that you are using can actually cater for that well, and that if the suggested methodology can't cater for it well, it will have a big impact on the amount of effort to support that going forward. I think that needs to be already considered at the start. If you're planning a design of your roles, does it actually provide you with the level of control you need on organizational levels?
Yeah. So I think there, you made a good point there. It's just defining what the controlling organizational levels, whether that be company code, plant, movement type, distribution, area, etc. So, and I think a lot of companies don't put enough emphasis in sitting with the business to say, what are the organizational levels that are important to us, and that we want to make sure that there's proper control all levels, and make sure that users don't get assigned all level values for which they do not belong. Can we also argue then, as part of the user access review process, that should also become a very important sort of activity that's done when the reviewers are performing their annual user access review, that they're not only looking at it from a perspective of saying, should this person be able to perform this function or this transaction code, they should also be looking at it and saying, has my user been assigned any incorrect organizational levels, so plants, company codes for which they do not belong? So that annual review should also be used to try and see if it can identify any incorrect assignments of all levels to the users, and hopefully that could also just clean up the solution to ensure that it's providing appropriate controls.
Yes, I think you made the point earlier, that it should be very obvious from the role assigned, or at least from the naming convention, what organizational levels does it actually contain. Sometimes there are mistakes that creep in, but that's where you would rely potentially on your GRC solution to point out those mistakes, and that is highlighted to the reviewer. And whether that would be done by a role content reviewer or then by the user to role reviewer, I think there's a great use case for that.
Okay, to summarize, organizational level control, very important sort of area of control, mainly more for the larger organizations that are clearly defined by distinct business units or country or territories, regions, where people shouldn't be able to perform certain functions into company codes or plants for which they do not belong. Unfortunately, it is a more technical and more difficult control to implement because of the way there's hundreds of thousands of authorization objects, which are many of them are shared between many transaction codes, and just because of the vastness of it, it does make it a little bit more challenging to make sure people are only have the correct old values for which they belong. And then if you are performing annual user access reviews, if you can encourage your reviewers to also start looking for roles that possibly contain all levels for which the user do not belong, and highlighting that as a possible role that could be removed. Good. Again, thanks for that. Until the next podcast, thanks for joining us. Thanks, Emile, for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, everyone.